Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the special joint meeting of the DeKalb City Council and the Finance Advisory Committee of the city, December 4, 2018. Prior to the roll calls this evening, I'd like to remind anyone in the audience who would like to speak to any item on the agenda. Primarily, we're going to be talking about the proposed FY 2019 budget, or for that matter, any item not on the agenda. Feel free to fill out a speaker request form in the back. Bring that up forward here if you would, or pass it up, and City Clerk Lynn Fazekas will see that I get it, and we'll get you on in the proper order. Having said that, I'm going to ask Lynn Fazekas to provide separate roll calls, one for the DeKalb City Council and one for the Finance Advisory Committee. Lynn?
Thank you. We'll start with the City Council. Jacobson?
Here.
Finucane?
Here.
Marquardt? Fagan?
Here.
Noriko?
Here.
Verbeek?
Here.
Favor?
Here.
Smith?
Here.
There are 7 present of the City Council. And now for Finance Advisory Committee. Peddle? Higgerson?
Here.
Neely?
Here.
Parker?
Here.
Parch?
Here.
Tarazinski.
Here.
5 present of the Finance Advisory Committee.
Thank you, Lynn. Just as a point of information, we do have 2 missing, one from each the Council and the Finance Advisory Committee. Alderman Marquardt called earlier, or I think sent me an email earlier this afternoon that he has a family commitment that he feels that he must attend, so he's not going to be with us tonight. And I understand Mike Peddle, who is the chair of the Finance Committee, notified City Manager Munch that he had some kind of a gastrointestinal problem, stomach bug, I guess, and will not be with us tonight. So, having said that, I'd like to ask folks to who is this a list of people who would like to speak?
Yes.
Lynn, okay. Just since we only have the one item on the agenda tonight, and that's the proposed 2019 budget, I am going to call the first 2 speakers who have indicated that they would like to be heard during public participation. And then I see one, the last one, Dwayne Brown, indicated budget. So I will let you defer on whether or not you'd like to make some comments regarding the budget, or for that matter, any other matter, as you come forward. If you opt not to, if you opt to wait for a bit, we can get you on as we go to item C under the agenda. So having said that, public participation, the first person to indicate that they'd like to speak is Kurt Thurmeyer.
Thank you, Mayor Smith. Good evening, everyone. So as many of you know, I've been a professor of public budgeting for almost 30 years, and especially focus on local government budgeting. The first thing that I teach my students, the very first day, is the first rule of budgeting, which is Tanstaffel. Now, I don't know if you know what Tanstaffel means, but people on this group probably do. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And this principle of budgeting is constantly violated over and over again to the detriment of the generations that follow us. Witness Illinois' pension debacle, the problems in Chicago, and so on. And the problem here is that people are unwilling to pay for the services they use. And the baby boomers are more guilty of this than almost any other generation. because they've run up credit cards over and over again for public services, and they want more, and they refuse to pay. They want to pay less. And at the last meeting, I was here for something else, but I was watching on the TV, and I was very, very disappointed that the city council chose not to take the growth in our assessed valuation, which we've been waiting for such a long time, and refused to capture that growth in evaluation to pay the bills for the services that we are currently using, especially the police and fire services. Because what the city council said was, no, we don't want to ask someone who owns a $150,000 house to pay $2 a month for police and fire services. Because what? They don't want the police to show up if there's a burglary? They don't want the fire department to come because it's too expensive at $2 a month? And by not paying the $25 now into the pension fund, you're asking your children and your grandchildren and the children of your grandchildren to pay that bill for the fire and police services that you are using today. Because when we have a firefighter or a police officer on our payroll, we have a commitment to them that they're going to have a pension. That's part of the deal. You get to run into a flaming, burning building with toxic chemicals because we're going to have a pension for you when you're done. But if you don't pay the $25 per household into the fund now, you have to pay it later. It doesn't go away. The bill remains. The question is, who's going to pay? Tonstoffel. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Somewhere, some way, somehow, somebody's going to pay. And I don't think it should be the children and the grandchildren of the people who are using police and fire services today. I think the council has to be responsible and make sure that you pay the bills for the services we are consuming today. The pension isn't a service later. The pension pays for services of people that we employ to do our public services today. So I strongly object to the council pushing this bill onto some other generation. That's not fair. I do want to applaud the council for refusing to cave in to the extortion of the school board for this outrageous claim that for some reason they weren't paying attention that, wait, there's charges for administration. This is nothing more than a craven money grab for money that they could have asked for a long time ago. And I think it's outrageous, unethical, and irresponsible for them to demand this kind of money from the city, and I applaud the city saying, we have tons of things that we need to do with that money. We have streets that are falling apart, we have sewer backups, and all kinds of other reasons that we should spend that money now. So thank you for that, and reconsider, please, dumping that $25 a year tax onto future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kurt. Will Heinisch?
Will Heinisch, DeKalb businessman, local landlord and property owner. I did provide with Lynn a copy of, for everybody on the council and all city staff that can be passed out a comment of my comments. Unfortunately, I have another meeting to go to tonight at 6:30, so I wanted to share these with you and publicly, and that you can always refer back to them. And it's a follow-up in regards to the letter I wrote to the council, the open letter I wrote to the council and to the finance committee. I assume you received it all. For those that aren't familiar with it, that it was posted publicly on DeKalb County Online today, and it compares the city of DeKalb to Dalton and what I think is some similarities between the two. And I got a lot of response, calls, emails, and some good conversation going in regards to that. So what I put together tonight are some future comments and reflections back from what I've heard from people. And I'll start with the current considerations for the next city manager, council, and finance advisory committee. A couple bullet points is to allow the new city manager flexibility to suggest future paths and outcomes, I would recommend balancing the budget with a hiring freeze and using fund balance. Push streets and fleet solution and process to next year. We need to maintain a business-friendly and attractiveness through correct policy decisions. We do not need to raise sales tax if DeKalb is to remain competitive and attract business. We already are at a disadvantage from 0.5% to 2% with our competitors. And I think the chief will agree with me that DeKalb cannot police or tax our way to prosperity. Fundamentals here have to change. And with that being said in mind, for future consideration for the next city manager, council, and finance advisory, I think what priority should growth of organic business be for the city of DeKalb? In the letter I sent to you, I said we either grow or we die, and I firmly believe by that statement. Is the distribution of funds to city departments in the correct proportions? I think next year we need to look at all departments, and is each department getting the correct proportion of funds? Do we earmark additional growth revenues for streets and fleets? If so, how and what percentage? What are the next steps to decrease costs to the city if we do not grow or we continue to remain stagnant? How do we measure the metrics of growth in comparison to the increase in costs each year? How do we evaluate and rank all services provided in all departments? We need to identify varying levels of reductions, of potential reductions in city services to balance potential shortfalls in the future. How about forming a committee and hiring an expert to evaluate outsourcing of all departments in the city and evaluate other cities that have done this? What other cities have been successful in doing this, and what departments? What are the positives and what are the negative effects? We should meet with the school district to jointly have the same goals for property taxes, as property tax saturation is negatively impacting our community and inhibiting growth. And if we fail to change, eventually we will fail. But I believe success can prevail with change being challenging. And something also very significant happened today. If anybody follows the markets, we're down 800 points. We had an inverted yield curve today. And if nobody knows what happens when the yield curve inverts, since the history of the Federal Reserve, Google it, and it's a predictor of the future, and it's very accurate. So with that, I appreciate your due diligence. I appreciate your time into this process, and have a healthy, good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Dwayne Brown?
I'm very disappointed in the Finance Advisory Committee's proposals for additional tax increases. I feel that the city of DeKalb already overtaxes its residents, and any increase would just compound the problem. One budget problems are accumulation of several things. First, passing a 2018 fiscal year budget with a $1.5 million deficit. The $250,000 transferred from the Intergovernmental Resource Benefit Cooperative, making the city's general fund appear to be $250,000 better off than it should be. And the hotel motel tax error. And an unrealized $1.8 million budget gap on top of the already known budget gap. One proposal was to increase the hotel motel tax from 7% to 7.5%, a tax Sycamore doesn't even have. Another was an amusement tax and self-storage tax, among many other increases. I had my niece visit me from Colorado, and we discussed taxes. I asked her what her sales tax rate was, and she said 5.5%. They have no bar and restaurant tax. Her property tax is half of what I pay, and her home is valued at 4 times the value of mine. DeKalb's taxes and spending are out of control. I asked my niece how long a property stays on the market in her area. She said between 3 and 5 days. The average detached home price out there is $419,000. I was reading an article in November issue of Money Magazine. It listed the best places to retire now. Coweta, Oklahoma, with a median home price of $188,000, an average property tax of $1,655, and a 5.8% sales tax rate, was rated number 1. One of the proposals the council made was to increase the fees per terminal from $250,000 to $1,000 for video gaming machines. The city is expected to receive close to $250,000 this fiscal year from video gaming. This would be devastating to that. Don't do it. I made a suggestion before the fiscal year 2018 budget was passed to have a hiring freeze. It didn't happen. Look at the situation we're in now. So what does council do? They hire 5 more police officers that we can't afford. The Finance Advisory Committee and the council need to come to the realization that we can't increase taxes or fees anymore. We need cuts and necessary staff reductions through attrition. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne. I have no other speaker request forms, so we're going to move forward now to item C on your agenda tonight, review of the proposed FY 2019 budget. I'd like to ask our interim city manager, Ray Munch, to speak to this item, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, if I can call your attention to the screens, I have a brief presentation that I'm going to walk you through this evening, and then that will hopefully guide your discussion. As you recall, we met on November 20th, our first joint meeting, and had discussions on the FY19 budget and the 2018 property tax levy. Tonight, what I would like to do is continue that discussion, and I'm going to start with a little bit of history as to what we've already accomplished in the 2019 budget process, talk a little bit about the funding gap as we believe it exists currently, review budget balancing measures that we've both already discussed and accepted into the FY19 budget, and others that we had discussed and have not been added to the budget at this point in time. And then I'm going to walk you through an update to the 5-year financial forecast as it stands today. So again, just very briefly, the budget process this year was laid out in great detail at the very beginning of the year. We've gone through months of discussions that started in January. We went through a pretty exhaustive process of every department giving both a service level review and a line item review of their budget. I think that was an important step this year. You know, I think people can say what they want about salaries and some other things, but I think what we came out of that line item budget review with is there's not a lot of fat that's hidden in there. You know, the department budgets for the most part are what they are. We reviewed our financial policies. We went through a pretty intense process of updating the 5-year financial plan and the financial forecast. And by June, we had worked our way up to presenting the updated 5-year financial plan and the five-year financial forecast. As you know, when that forecast was updated, that projected the initial $1.68 million deficit that we continued to work on through the summer and into the fall months. In August, we reviewed both the prior year's audit for the city and the actuarial reports for the police and fire pension funds. And by September and October, we had actually gotten into the process of balancing the budget. We had several discussions on the property tax levy and the direction to take on that for the coming year. And both the FAC and the City Council went through very detailed lists of potential budget balancing measures that had been identified by staff that included both expenditure reductions and revenue increases. The process has continued through November and December. We had our initial joint City Council FAC meeting, and we continue to move forward with both the adoption of the property tax levy and the annual budget. So that brings us to the projected FY19 funding gap, which we've talked about quite a bit and understandably has been a little confusing at times because it seems like we're talking about a moving target. So I want to walk you through the history of that once again. So we go back to July of 2018 when we first completed the 5-year financial forecast. Staff provided an update that showed an approximate $1.68 million gap by the end of fiscal year 19. With the budget balancing measure discussions that both FAC and City Council went through, we arrived at some decisions on those budget balancing measures that brought that down to a number closer to 240,000. If you recall, the budget balancing measures actually brought us closer to zero, but we had some additional discussion on the property tax levy and a change in direction on that, which adjusted the projections for property tax levy revenue. In November, a number of issues came to light, which we talked about in great detail at our last joint meeting, that brought that projected funding gap closer to 1.8 million. Those included the issues with the health insurance funds, building permit revenues that were projected somewhat high, TIF revenues and TIF transfers into the general fund. So as we worked through all those issues, we identified a much higher funding gap than what we believed it to be in October. As it stands today, Acting Finance Director Bob Miller and myself, along with other members of staff, have worked pretty diligently to go through the budget as it's been entered. And as we've gone through that process, we continue to identify items that either we didn't anticipate or were inaccurate. I will tell you that as we went through that process, it's a very fluid situation. I would say on a near daily basis, we take a look at the budget and find something that we didn't expect. Some of those are positive surprises. So for example, last week we located approximately $160,000 in expenditures that were carried forward from FY18 into FY19, even though they're not recurring expenditures for the following year. So like I said, there's been positive surprises as we've gone through this process. But as we've gone through this process to align the numbers that are included in the proposed budget that was published and the 5-year financial forecast, we've been able to conclude that the realistic funding gap at this point for the end of FY19 is about $890,000. One thing that I want to point out in terms of that number is that, again, keeping in mind that we're coming across new information on almost a daily basis, is last night we identified a potential or a contemplated $450,000 transfer from the capital fund into the general fund. And that was contemplated for 2018 based on some purchases that weren't made. If you recall back to the budget process last year, we talked about a $180,000 purchase for a dump truck, and that purchase never came to fruition in this budget year. So it was entered into the proposed budget that those funds be transferred to, again, cover the funding gap, or so we presume, as opposed to the actual purchase of the dump truck. So that is something that we continue to evaluate. I can't tell you with any level of certainty that we would make that fund transfer. It's something that Mr. Miller and I have to continue to evaluate over the next few days. But that's where we stand today in terms of that funding gap. We've gone through this process of identifying budget balancing measures, and in doing so, as mentioned, we've looked at both revenues and expenditures. So from the revenue side, we identified and built into the budget a number of revenue increases. Those include fee increases attributed to ambulance billing, false fire alarm fees, and an intercept ambulance fee. We have contemplated a 0.5% increase in the hotel motel tax and the implementation of a 5% self-storage tax. In total, those revenue increases total $415,000. On the expenditure side, we achieved $1.1 million in expenditure reductions. Those were primarily personnel-related costs to the tune of $785,000 and operating expenses just north of $300,000. So again, there was this comprehensive list of budget balancing measures that both the FAC and the City Council went through over the course of several months. And what you have on the screen in front of you here is sort of the list of what's left on the table that we talked about at some point in time and didn't reach consensus that it was right to implement for the city in FY19. So again, there's a number of personnel related measures that remain on that list in terms of both specific positions and contemplated pay increases for non-bargaining unit employees. You also have operating expenses that are still a consideration in terms of municipal band funding and some of the funding that goes to our partner agencies such as the DC EDC, Chamber of Commerce, and Convention and Visitors Bureau. So that list is again what's sort of still on the table for consideration if you so desire. One thing that we talked about, and this was sort of new to the conversation at the last joint meeting, was the idea of a hiring freeze. This is not an idea that had been discussed broadly over the course of this budget process, so it required some additional research and background. And what I can tell you, and the backup material goes into greater detail, is that I would say the two concerns in a hiring freeze are those that are public safety related with the police and the fire department. So I engaged in conversations with both command staffs of the police and fire department and asked them for their honest recommendations of what could and could not be accomplished in terms of a hiring freeze. And I asked for their honesty in doing that. And what they gave me was fairly detailed, and that's outlined in the backup. But essentially, what you would see if you desired to pursue that path would be initial hiring of police officers and one promotion January 1st, and then deferring or delaying the hiring of 2 additional police officers until June 1st. And in the police department's case, that June 1st date is important because of the potential for having to send new officers to police academy training. And because we don't hold academy training in-house, that's sent out to the state police or PTI in Champaign, those dates are already set in stone, so we have to be cognizant of that when we have that discussion. From the fire department's perspective, I believe their strong preference in order to avoid excessive overtime would be to fill 1 vacancy January 1st and hold a second vacancy for either 6 or 12 months. And I think that would be something that would be evaluated as we move throughout the fiscal year and see what impact that vacancy is truly having on the department in terms of overtime and operating costs. The other ones that you see there, the Public Works Department has a superintendent for the street department. I've talked to the Public Works Director, although it would be stressful from an operating standpoint. They're confident that they could come up with a model where those duties would be fulfilled under their current command structure, and we could delay that hiring for some period of time. You have a vacant code compliance inspector in the Community Development Department. Director Charlton has indicated that that vacancy could remain for the course of FY19. And the police department has one other civilian position, a community services officer, that could also remain vacant for the time being, according to the chief. In total, if you were to take those cuts, and the other thing that is included in there, the city manager's office. So if we're talking about hiring an assistant city manager and filling a management analyst role, as I mentioned last time, there's presumably a lag once you hire your city manager for those next pieces to fall into place. So conservatively, I put those at a 6-month delay in hiring and took the savings there. So in total, those positions that I've detailed will give you about a $478,000 cost savings over the course of fiscal year 2019. So the other budget balancing measures that we discussed a little bit at our last joint meeting, and there was requests for clarification on some of the numbers that were included in the backup, were the home rule sales tax increase. Again, we're looking at every 1/4% increase of the home rule sales tax, equating to about $1 million in additional revenue. Again, that is a full year collection. So for fiscal year 19, in terms of sales tax, you're probably looking at half of that. Restaurant, bar, and packaged liquor, each 1/4% increase is about $250,000 annually. Again, that is a local collection, so it probably would be 9 months of collection in the first year that you would realize. The other revenue that I've added back in here, because we continue to hear at least some talk about it, is the idea of an amusement tax. We've continued to research this. This one's a little bit more difficult to provide an accurate revenue projection on, but we did have some discussions with other municipalities that employ this type of tax, and I think at this point a safe estimate would be we could realize about $120,000 annually at a 5% rate. Again, that is looking at imposing a tax on entertainment, sale of movie theater tickets, concerts, live shows. It would not include things such as your NIU sporting events, football, basketball. It could presumably include private events at the Convocation Center, like concerts and live shows, but not university-specific events. The other consideration, we had first reading of the property tax levy at our last regular city council meeting. The direction and passage on first reading was to keep that model that we talked about of only capturing the new construction growth, which was that lower property tax revenue rate that we've discussed. So in terms of where that brings us this evening in terms of the FY19 fund balance projection, as I mentioned, that puts us at a variance to our 25% fund balance target at about $887,000. In terms of a percentage, that puts you at 22.6%. So you're closer than you were on November 20th, but there's still a little ways to go. In terms of a recommendation moving forward, for tonight's conversation, my recommendation to you is to continue your discussion to finalize the FY19 annual budget. That discussion should continue to address the funding gap as is possible through the options that we've presented so far. And from there, I would recommend that, in understanding that we went through this year-long budget process in 2018, would be to continue that process into 2019. However, I think the conversation needs to be a little bit different next year. We discussed on November 20th the potential for more joint FAC City Council meetings and working together to come to some conclusions as how long-term finances can be resolved for the city. And I think that's probably a very smart idea. The most important consideration looking out long-term is the pension liabilities and how we're going to address that. And that is the real discussion that needs to be had. We can come back year by year and look at the next $500 or $1 million that we're going to cut. But in reality, this is a situation that needs a long-term solution because the pension issue is not going away. Once again, the very important consideration there is the fact that we're looking to bring a new city manager on board, hopefully within the next 60 days. And hopefully that person has a vision or some level of knowledge and expertise that can help the organization move forward and streamline a bit and look at what the city of DeKalb should really look like in the future. So those are my recommendations for how we proceed tonight. Before we dive into that discussion, the request was made of me to look at and show how this impacts the 5-year financial forecast that we worked so hard on over the course of the year. And I'm going to show you that. And one of the things that we came across in terms of these, as I mentioned, these constantly moving targets, and it was brought up at the last joint meeting, was what's the real projection for property tax revenue over the next 5 years? And there was some question at the last joint meeting of what that looked like, because in the 5-year financial forecast, it actually had a pretty positive trend. But if you really look at it in reality, what was baked into that, I think it's fair to say that that projection was based on what the city should be levying for property taxes to achieve its financial policy to levy the full amount of your police and fire pensions. And what, from my understanding of the projection, what was backed out of that was the $450,000 or $500,000 in general fund support that the police and fire pension funds have seen over the past few years, because we haven't levied that full amount. So we ran these property tax levy projections, and this is in the backup material. But if you look across the top line, that's the current 5-year property tax levy projection. Again, those numbers really reflect what you should be levying to meet the financial policy related to property tax levies and funding your pensions. But in reality, when we took a deeper dive into that and ran a projection based on what I would say the more recent history of the city council's preference for property tax levies, you see numbers that are quite a bit different. So if you take it out to 2020, the projection was 6.7 million. When in reality, if you projected it from the methodology that you used this year to only capture new property growth, it's actually about 6.2 million. So you can see where that gap starts to widen as you go out into future years. So this would be your ending fund balance projection with the property tax levy revenue as it's currently projected, the assumption we've been working off for this budget year. And you can see, if you look at fiscal year 18 and 19, which is really what I've been focused on over the past several weeks, and fixing that problem as best we can, you can see that there's that significant dip from 17 to 18, and we make a little bit of that up in 19 and get closer to your target, but then that projection starts to fall off as those pension liabilities continue to accrue. Again, this is assuming that you're levying for the full police and fire pension actuarially required contribution minus about $450,000 a year. So what I'm about to show you is what happens to that projection if you continue to levy property taxes under a significantly more conservative approach of only capturing for new construction growth, which for this year was 0.2%. So that was the calculation we used moving forward. And as you can see, that has a significant impact when you get out to fiscal year 2023, because as the pension liability continues to grow and revenues do not keep pace with that, you start to eat up your reserves to, at some point, in the tune of about $2 million a year. So I think that last slide sort of reinforces the fact that we have issues down the road that need to be addressed. And to presume that those issues can be addressed in a very condensed timeline of passing a budget, which is required by state statute over the course of the next 2 weeks or so, would be extremely difficult. So at this point, I think I'll leave you to discuss that and answer any questions that you might have of me or Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Ray. Prior to opening it up to general discussion here, in looking at the background information, and I again commend staff for putting together what I think is the best numbers that we have, as you say, as of 12/4/2018. And on pages 13 and 14 of that document, you'll see that staff has provided three broad options, for discussion among City Council and the Finance Advisory Committee. These include, number one, reconsider and implement additional expenditure reductions to close that funding gap. Number two, reconsider and implement revenue increases to close that funding gap. And it could be a combination of those two. And number three, consider approval of a balanced FY19 budget, which uses the fund balance to address what actually has been the FY18 revenue shortfall. And staff is requesting that we provide clear direction moving forward, so as the first and second meeting of the annual budget ordinance, which is scheduled for December 10th, first reading next Monday, and December 18th, which would be second reading and finalization, final approval of that FY 2019 budget, would be where we want to arrive at. So that's sort of what I would consider is sort of an executive summary, if you will, of what it is that we're being charged with this evening. And with that, I would open it up for any questions or comments. Lynn Neely.
Hello, I have a question. I want to make sure I understand. The document that you sent last week on page 1 references that for FY19 there is a 1.17 million funding gap under the current fund balance policy. So what you showed us this evening, though, that's no longer true, correct? And it's actually the $887,000, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think that amended version was sent out, was it not, Ray?
That was communicated to City Council.
To City
before
Council,
the
okay.
weekend, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
That explains it. Thank you.
Tom Tarasinski.
Thank you. A couple things. Thanks for the overview and the moving us forward and providing some options that I think are in a package that can be discussed. And I was hoping that the Finance Advisory Committee could at least, with a show of hands, give some input on some of those options if we get to the point where we feel we can do that in a meaningful way. If we don't, so be it. But I think that might be helpful to the council. One thing, I had an opportunity to talk to the acting city manager earlier today with clarification on one item, and that is what is our unassigned general fund balance that we're starting with. So I'd draw your attention to attachment A for those who have today's backup material, and it will shed just a little bit different starting point, which has an impact on our end point, and it has an impact on the suggestion that we're looking at about a $900,000 gap. And that is that the general fund balance at the end of 12/31/17, the unassigned portion of that is 8.2 million, or some 800,000 less. And the reason that's true is a part of the general fund balance of 9.1 million or thereabouts has been assigned to the airport and its deficit. So in that respect, that 12/31/17 balance is off about 800 grand, and that just walks its way forward. So that comes from the CAFR, the annual report, and the audited annual report from year-end 17, right? That was delivered to you in July or August this year. So I wanted to bring that forward. So as we discuss our ability to pass something temporarily, if we're looking at a $900,000 goal, this would maybe change that goal to about $1.7 million in the same, to get you to that same position of, I think you mentioned 22% or 22.5% or whatever that equivalent there is. So as the rest of the discussion takes forward, I think that beginning point is something that has to be considered, okay? Just setting the ground floor.
Please repeat that, Tom. Our target right
Well,
now is?
What I'm suggesting is that the target is really about 800,000 different in that the unassigned balance that we're starting from is from this schedule, and Schedule A is 800,000 less than what we think it is, because part of that general fund balance has been assigned
To the airport.
to the airport.
Okay.
And that's why last time I was one at least who brought up that trying to wipe out the airport deficit, the way you would do that is probably take a transfer from the general fund to do it. That would zero out that fund balance and you wouldn't have it, but it would lower the general fund balance. And I think that's right, Bob, is that that's about the unassigned balance?
The unassigned balance that is actually in the CAFR is actually police forfeiture money. It's not assigned to the airport.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because there's a loan in there for, what, 478,000?
For about 470,000,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
There's a due.
So the unassigned balance is 8272 or something like that, as of the 12/31/17. Just reading the report.
The unassigned is, 8.2.
Yes, okay,
Yep.
thank you. So I just want to establish that as our baseline. So when we're looking at what we're solving for, that we're considering that as well, so.
Thank you, Tom. Alderman Jacobson, did you have a comment?
A couple, actually, just trying to understand some of the basics here. Do we have a list of where effectively $1 million came from between meetings? I realize that we've been going through the budget with a fine-tooth comb to understand where those things are, and I know several of them have been discussed, but do we have any sort of backup that explains where that $1 million change in balance is at this point?
Yeah, so one of the things that you have to understand is when we're working through this, we're working through it off two different platforms. So your 5-year financial forecast is essentially an Excel spreadsheet that we've been working off of. And that doesn't talk to our budget software system and what is actually inputted into the budget by the departments at budget time. So the exercise that we've been going through is to reconcile that every expenditure that's entered into the budget software aligns with the assumptions that were put into the 5-year financial forecast spreadsheet. And as we've aligned those two, that's where we've reduced that number. So it's anything from adjusting the figures we talked about last time in building permits and the health insurance funding, the realization this week of, $160,000 in police expenditures carried forward that are no longer existing expenditures. When you started to tally all those up, that's what brought that number down.
My question is, do we have any backup of that tally? I mean, it ended up in a $1 million positive
Yeah, it went from
balance
$1.8 million
for us.
to $8 million.
$1.8 million to $8 million at this point. what are those tallies? I'd like to see a list of those tallies to understand where that $1 million came from. I appreciate that it's in tweaking the numbers, but how and where, I guess, is the question I have that I was surprised wasn't in the backup today, to get a better understanding of where that's from. Additionally, just again, preliminary stuff. Looking at the vacant service positions in Table 5 in the backup. My understanding is we have several other vacancies that will be vacant January 1st as well, including an HR director and a deputy chief in the fire department. I mean, are there any other positions that haven't been included in this list?
When we went through the discussion on October 16th of budget balancing measures, if staff received consensus from council that those would be accepted for FY19, those are already built into the budget. So those aren't hiring freezes. Those have been eliminated from the staffing plan and are already incorporated into the budget at this point.
That's on your Table 4, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so anything that's in Table 2 as an expenditure reduction has already been incorporated into the proposed budget.
Did answer your question, Dave?
Yeah, I'm just looking to check and see if there's any more. I appreciate that. I didn't catch that in Table 2. In talking about the airport shortage, and just so I have this clear, again, I know we've tackled it in different ways over the past probably 8 or 10 years, and how we refund that negative balance. That negative balance is showing as a negative balance in the airport fund, and the money's been already taken from the general fund to cover those expenditures, correct?
Cash. Yeah, cash.
Cash.
Yeah.
So it would have already affected that line item balance, and we'd know what our remaining fund balance is, correct? I mean, I know the way it was explained in the past, when we had this discussion a few years ago when Tom was on the council, when we eliminated that deficit, is it wasn't an actual deficit to the fund because those expenditures had already been paid for out of cash balances annually. And we were accruing a negative in that fund effectively to show what had been loaned from the general fund into the airport, but that the negative wasn't an actual negative. It was up to cash accrual accounting. We knew what our fund balance was, and that was if the airport ever became functional again, that we'd know what we'd have to pay back. But it wasn't an actual negative that was hitting the general fund that was unassigned somewhere. And that's the question. Is this, as Tom is believing it is, or is saying it is at this point, is it an actual cash negative that is not accounted for in fund balance? Or is it a pseudo-negative in the fact that those bills have been paid throughout the year and we've already deducted that from our fund balance?
I'm just trying to look at it at the big picture here. It is a receivable on in the general fund as a due from the airport fund. And it was a cash transaction, so that would not have affected fund balance because it did not affect revenues or expenditures. But it is a receivable that is due to the city. So once it's paid back, the city, the general fund is made whole.
So of that $9.1 million balance, effectively $800,000 of that is an IOU from the airport fund to the general fund.
Yeah, cash, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Steve Parker.
I had the same question that all Jason had. It kind of surprised me that we went from 1.8 to 8, $1 million all of a sudden we found or something like that. But the second question, I just want to make sure I understand. On the transfers from the TIF, the general fund for administrative costs, were scheduled at $100,000. Is that right?
Correct.
Why is that the right number? I mean, it just seems to me that what's been going on in TIF in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of hours put in with the new projects, and lately with, basically defending themselves from attacks. But it seemed arbitrary, and it seems like it might be low.
I think it's a fair statement to say that it could be low, but at this point in time, with the discussions that have taken place, we took an extremely conservative approach to that. If I could call Attorney Frieders, who's handling our TIF work now, maybe he could expand upon that.
As we look at FY19 and as we look at adopting some best practices for transparency, one of the things that the city will be looking to implement is actual time tracking for expenses that are billed to the TIF. So through the new financial software that is being implemented right now, the city will have the ability to do actual tracking. We, as we put estimates in the budget, have been extremely conservative. We recognize that those may be conservative. If the actual expenditures are in excess of that, that's something the city can evaluate at a later date with budget amendments. But it's our intention to track all of the charges that go in a very detailed fashion to provide a very clear accounting of every expenditure that's charged to the TIF. So we anticipate as we get through the year, we'll have better updated figures on that we'll be sharing with the FAC, with the City Council, and if the Council adopts some of the amendments to Chapter 37 that have been proposed, it'd be shared with the Joint Review Board as well.
And I assume that would include your time, because obviously it's been a lot of time.
That would include any city resources that are being put towards it, yes.
Bob Higgerson.
What is our legal timeline for adopting a budget? I mean, do we have to do it right today or tomorrow or a month from now, or can we
I'm gonna have
take a
Attorney Frieders
temporary
address that one,
budget? I
too.
mean, what are we shooting at here?
So I think there are a couple of good questions in there, and this is something that arose last year as well. And I think the analogy that was made last year, I think it was Alderman Verbeck, had indicated, the state of Illinois goes without passing a budget from time to time, the federal government does. With regard to municipality, the law is pretty clear that you can't incur an expenditure unless you have a budget. And so we would strongly recommend that the city have some form of budget in place before the start of the FY19 fiscal year, which is January 1, 2019. That said, the budget process applicable to the city is very flexible in that that budget can be amended at any point in time during the fiscal year. So I would suggest that your immediate goal would be adopting a budget that is agreeable to the City Council, that will allow the city to continue operations in whatever format you believe appropriate, to fund those operations on a short-term basis, and to give the FAC and the City Council time to evaluate the great volume of information that's being provided to you with regard to what interim city manager Munch has found.
That's exactly my point.
Yeah, and in layman's terms, Bob, the way I understand it is that we want a budget in place by the end of the year for the very reasons that that Dean was expressing. But I think we have an extraordinary circumstance here in that even though the balance may not be totally balanced, if you will, we have a situation where we have a new city manager, and we would want that person to be able to weigh in on what needs to be done to get us to a point. It does not do away with what Ray was expressing, and that is that our primary liability of these is this pension situation. And, we need to, going forward, no matter what numbers we may arrive at by December 31st, 2018, we need to realize what the situation is as it relates to those pension liabilities, and to, underfund that on an ongoing basis, at least to me, is not the answer. Kate Noriko.
In the interest of speaking about specifics, I would support and encourage the council to, and the Finance Advisory Committee to consider a 6-month hiring freeze so that the incoming city manager has an opportunity to assess our organizational structure and impact that. Consider positions as they may open up and would have to come before the council. Consider also in the increase in the restaurant and bar and packaged liquor tax. Again, as I've pointed out before, I see that as discretionary spending. And even though I know this probably won't have any impact, you know, I still believe that we should have voted for the other tax levy. As Professor Thurmeyer pointed out, the impact for a homeowner of a $150,000 home was relatively minimal, so that would mean homes at an assessed lower value would see less of an impact. And finally, and I've thought a great deal about this, I know we worked really hard at coming up with fair expenditure reductions. I was struck by the fact that if we reduce the Convention and Visitors Bureau by $10,000, they actually end up taking a $20,000 hit because of the state reduction. So I'd ask us to take a look at whether we reduce theirs, if 10,000 really is a reasonable amount. I know that means a reduction somewhere else, but I think it would be a reasonable discussion.
Thank you. Lynn Neely.
Hello, this could be either in addition to the things that Kate was saying or an alternative, however you wish to think of it. Kate, I agree with you 100% about the delay in hiring, such as, isn't that what I'm seeing in Table 6 from the original send, right? That there's a 6-month delay on part of them and there's a 12-month furlough on the others, right?
Correct.
Okay, and that total would get us to $478,310 toward our 800 and whatever it is, 887,000 gap that we're looking for to solve immediately?
Correct.
Okay, in addition to that, so that's got us almost up at $500,000. Okay, if you look at, is it the home rule tax that at 1/4 of 1%, so that's a quarter on $100, and it doesn't apply to food and it doesn't apply to medicine. We could pick up $500,000 in the next year, given the time it would take to implement it and come back. Isn't that correct?
Correct. There's statutory filing requirements
Right.
for sales tax.
And then on the one about restaurants, bars, packaged liquor, if you implemented an increase of 1/4 on a $100 purchase, given the statutory limits and the filing requirements and all that, if I understand correctly, you could collect another $187,500. If you tally those, you get $1,165,810, I think, unless my ink pen or my brain malfunctioned, which is possible.
No, it is not possible.
So that would fill the immediate gap. And we would be left with a tiny excess amount if everything goes as planned, which is highly unlikely.
Yeah.
But It's in line with what you're saying, Kate, as far as filling the immediate necessity. Clearly, the pensions, as I said a year ago, are the number one problem we've got. But, okay, that's all I've got with the new number. I had all these things worked out with the old numbers, but this is all I've got with the new numbers. Thank you.
Yeah. Alderman Fagan, thank you, Kate.
You know, we've had
Or
a lot,
Lynn, thank you.
With only two of us for all this.
we've had a lot of pushback on the restaurant bar tax, and I know it's only 25 cents on a $100 purchase, but I know, I agree with you. I agree with you. I don't have a problem with it, but would we be better off on implementing an amusement tax that we don't have now, and that is discretionary spending, rather than restaurants, DeKalb restaurants, competing against other towns' restaurants?
You're going to drive Sycamore for a quarter.
I told you I didn't have a problem with it, Lynn. I'm just saying, what I'm just saying is, because you're looking at revenue of 150 to 350,000,
Yeah.
compared to the 180.
That's just what you can
187.
collect. That's what
Right.
But it's actually a larger number, but what you can collect given the constraints
Right.
of implementation.
Well, I'm just throwing it out, Lynn. I mean, I'm saying it because, yeah, I mean, that's what we're all here for. But, that's discretionary spending and amusement tax, and that's also tax that we're getting from people that are coming from out of town, that are going to the convocation center, that are going to I mean, you go into any type of venue there at the convocation center, and it's everybody from all over. So that's when I'm throwing it in there for possible.
Dave?
Excuse me while I jump around a little bit here, but I will start with that amusement tax idea. Again, I think that when we talked about additional revenues would be one that I could come to supporting. I think in addition to some of the things Alderman Fagan brought up, it also helps to provide an additional payback on events at the Egyptian Theater that we've invested significantly in, that can help bring in some of a return on the city's dollars and taxpayers' dollars, that I think is an added benefit of that. I know it was mentioned that we couldn't require NIU, obviously, to pay for the football games and athletics because they are a state facility. My understanding is that they could voluntarily do so. And again, I think that's a conversation we should approach. They can collect that tax if they so choose. Understanding that, again, that's a pass-through to their ticket buyers and not a direct cost for the university. And understanding additionally that especially the football games and some of the other events NIU hosts, whether it be homecoming or other events, are a significant drain on our public services that I don't feel are being paid for adequately by the university. When understanding our fire revenues are already lowest in comparable conference universities and likely lowest or amongst the lowest in the state, I think our fire services are already being underfunded by NIU and have been for quite some time. I think the police services certainly are being underfunded by some of the drag NIU's events and event weekends are causing on our police force, and I think we should look to recapture some of those dollars being spent, most especially in overtime, to support those events as partners. And I think it would behoove us to engage in that conversation with them now in saying, no, we can't force you because you're state property, but is this something you're willing to step up and be a partner with us on? I think that is more than fair of us to ask, to see if they would be willing to voluntarily add that tax into their ticketing. In terms of the negative fund balance, which again I brought up the last time I spoke, my understanding when we fixed those annual negatives last time and gave interfund transfers from the general fund was that annually they could not continue beyond a 1 year time frame, that effectively at the end of the year under fund balance that those negatives would be swallowed back up by an interfund loan, whether it was from the general fund or elsewhere, and they couldn't continue to accrue as negatives going forward against the general fund. And if that's not the case, absolutely remember that was our intent at the time when we had that discussion, that they couldn't continue to carry through. I mean, at that point, I think the airport fund was over $1.2 million in negative interfund loans back to the general fund, and when we wiped it out, the intent was to not allow those, most especially the airport fund, but those specialty funds, to create a drag against our unassigned fund balance. And I think we should take a look at that now to ensure, A, what the fund balance policy says, and B, if we're meeting it entirely, to ensure that there's not a situation where we're showing a $9 million fund balance, and in reality, we have a $9 million accrued negative at the airport, and it means we have $0 in the bank. I think that's, for transparency and budgeting, annually, those should be swept out and cleaned up so that there is no accrued negative. And I know that was the discussion a few years ago, and it stayed that way for a couple years, and now it looks like it's starting to accrue again. Let's put a stop to it now before it escalates to a point that can be very confusing in terms of reading the budget, and especially when council is trying to understand the fund balance, that they may not realize that that negative is actually taking away what is showing as actual fund balance. Jumping back to something that was said earlier in the meeting and that the mayor brought up, pension liabilities. We are not underfunding our pension liabilities. We are paying the full liabilities that our actuaries are telling us we have to pay. The reality is they are not coming entirely from property tax revenues. And understanding what the EAV and the average home value in the community is at this point, it's effectively an impossibility now to do so, and certainly will be so going forward, looking at what those projections look like. You cannot expect the taxpayers to have their share of our city's taxes increases at 10 or 12% a year. It's just not feasible. And we are tied to that revenue source because it's an internal fund balance policy that says so. There are other revenue sources that we could tie and assign that are slightly less stable as property taxes are, and clearly the stability is one of the key rating factors in bond ratings, but that are very stable, not necessarily guaranteed as we assume property taxes will be, but very stable revenue sources that could be assigned long-term to start eating into that gap. The reality is the home values here are not increasing fast enough. In reality, they are stagnant at best. And to assume long-term that we can continue to raise our share of the tax burden on the residents 10 or 12% a year is a fallacy. And we've known that for years. But to say that we're underfunding them, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. In reality, they are being funded. We are meeting that full burden. The tax levy coming from property tax is not and will never be enough to be able to fund the amount of payments required annually. And I think that's the important thing to take away from that.
Yeah, I stand corrected on that, David. Thank you.
Again, I appreciate many of Dr. Thurmeyer's comments, but the reality that it was $15 of services now is not true. The 4% EAV increase this year is a multiplier from the state. There is no anecdotal evidence right now in the market that in the main driver of those of property taxes, residential property, that those properties are underassessed or undervalued. And we'll know that next year based on the quadrennial when the assessors come back and do a property by property understanding of what some of these homes are worth. And my understanding, both from the county and the township, is at some level a large skew of that 4% multiplier that is being pushed by the state is coming from the change in value on commercial properties. It really isn't coming from the residential properties, which is again, the main base of our taxpayers are the residential properties. And I think that will change. Many assessments will change during the quadrennial next year. And I think we'll get a better understanding of that in a year. But to claim that that's growth internally within the city, I think, again, is a misnomer. And I think it's unfair to claim this phantom 4% number based on a couple months of home sales, as the market is certainly nationwide again starting to fizzle out based on mortgage rates and other things. I think is a desperation plot to try to capture some revenue while we think we may have a chance. It just doesn't exist. The reality is that most of the homeowners are still seeing flat values that are well below their values of where they were in 2008. not including for inflation. When you include for inflation, they are significantly lower valued than they were in 2008. So the belief that we are growing, I think, is unfair to a point in how it's being skewed. And again, I don't think that's coming from the city. Some of that's coming from the state and from some of the assessment numbers we're seeing. But to pretend that it's only $15, again, is a misnomer. When you're talking 4% of value across the board increase, you're talking at a $150,000 home, its EAV would be about $50,000, which that's where your tax value is calculated. The city's value at that point is about 10% of that number, of course, and I think it is, when you understand what the total understanding and number of those taxes are, it's not supporting city services, it's supporting retirement services that are future services. And I think that's where, again, there's going to be a difference in politics and a difference of understanding. At some point, when you're asking your homeowners whose average income is half of your employees, and one of the comments Dr. Thurmeyer made was, well, we're promising these pensions to people that risk their lives on the job. I appreciate that, and that's why pensions were created. But the same argument is used to justify their six-figure salaries. You can't have your cake and eat it too. If you're making significantly higher than the community because you have a dangerous job, you're getting your money on the front end. You can't expect both to get it on the front end and the back end. When pensions were created, they were created when the money on the front end was atrocious, was barely livable on, and you certainly couldn't save money long-term to put away and live off of. Now to understand that these employees are making more than twice the average household income of the people paying the taxes to support their retirement, again, there's a fundamental fairness issue there that's a problem. And to understand that we cannot raise those taxes at a rate that would ever keep up with these pension ramp-up requirements means we're going to have to look long-term into additional funding sources outside of property tax as a dedicated revenue to meet that unfunded gap every year. And instead of doing that, what we've been doing is taking it off the top of the general fund, which is hurting our revenues and hurting our ability to have unassigned funds to use for today's operations. So then it is incumbent on this council and the next, and those beyond it, to identify additional revenue streams or segregate revenue streams that will meet that pension gap to relieve the tax burden, again, an impossibility based on our EAVs, on home and business owners, because they're taking a significant share of those costs, and they are a fraction of the overall citizenship that is enjoying those services that the city, both police, fire, public works, management, all those things, receive. So again, I think that's something long-term in our strategies, when we're talking future strategies, is something we need to look at, is what is that funding revenue source going to look like, and how do we dedicate it in that it is a, not necessarily a guaranteed revenue source, but a very stable income source that will help reduce that tax burden long-term to ensure our fund balances don't end up at zero in 5 or 7 years. Last issue, CVB. I had a couple people reach out on the same issue, and I, again, am finding myself agreeing with Kate that, again, not understanding that that was a double hit to them in terms of the match that they're getting from the state. The question that was asked of me by at least 2 different people engaged and involved and aware of what the CVB is how do you believe it's appropriate to, at the same time you are increasing your hotel and motel taxes, then take funding away from the advertising arm of those sources? If you're going to raise that tax, that's fair to support that service, but how do you raise the tax in the face of lowering the expenditures? So again, I think that's something we do need to look at. In reality, it's a $10,000 or what was it, $12,000 cut. It's not budget breaking in the face of a $10,000 cut in the face of an $800,000 shortfall. It changes that number so small in terms of what the effect will be on the overall budget, and it could result in, again, the reduction of a significant revenue stream for the city that I think we should probably take a look at and see if that makes the most sense right now.
David, for the past 2 years, we have been nickel-diming ourselves in these conversations. And that is one of the examples of the nickel-diming on DCCVB. I think the presentation that was made by the Convention and Visitors Bureau and pointing out that for every $10,000 they raise locally, they get a state match to that point. So it does make sense. How that extrapolates into your argument, Dave, about increasing the amusement tax, I don't know if I buy that totally, but I appreciate the point.
Increasing hotel and motel, which is
Yeah,
already
hotel,
in this
motel, yeah.
budget. Again, we're increasing their tax effectively, and then saying we're going to provide you a reduced service
Right.
in the face of an increase, I think is unfair.
Thank you. Alderman Favor.
So I'm in favor of the 6-month hiring freeze. I could potentially get on board with the amusement tax. One of the ones that came out of from the meeting this week or last week with the Central Business District was the snow plowing or the snow removal, and I know that's a pretty hot issue with them. I would like to see that taken out of the budget. We're making a significant investment with our TIF dollars and things downtown. I know
You mean
there's a
take
lot-
that reduction out of the budget?
Take the reduction out of
Yeah,
the
right.
budget. I don't know if we could bid it, do a, an RFP, if there's something else we could do. I know there's several business owners that aren't, or property owners that aren't here. There's also empty buildings. If we're not taking care of that, it's going to be a mess.
Tom?
I'd like to address that
Yeah,
very
sure,
briefly,
sure.
if I may. So, we're fortunate or unfortunate enough to have a blizzard around Thanksgiving to kind of give us a preview of the impact that might have. And had discussions with Director Holdman and Assistant Director Favor about this, and there's options out there in terms of snow removal in the CBD, and one of them is making capital purchases so that we own the equipment to functionally do what the contractor does. Maybe there's a long-term savings in that, but for the time being, I think as we evaluate staffing and the availability of resources, that is probably a reduction that has more value than what we see on its face.
Yeah, Tom.
In an attempt to move this forward from a recommendation standpoint, at least in my thoughts, because of the number of open items and the varied opinions, this idea of maintaining an open budget and allowing amendments with an anticipation of a specific goal in mind, at least a target, if you would, might make some sense. I don't think dropping this thing as we did last year and then start talking about policy for 5 months, we wasted a lot of time rather than dealing with real ongoing budget issues. And we didn't spend the time on the detail in some respects. You have a balanced budget, as you know, and it's slightly positive for 19. You have a couple variations of a 6-month freeze, and I think the Finance Advisory Committee has taken that up earlier in prior years and made recommendations to that extent that I think were basically supported, and I think with a show of hands they might be able to support that as well. If it's the Schedule 6 option, which is 478, or a hard 6 months off of your Table 5, they're within 50 or 60 grand of each other, that 6-month column or the full year column on Table 6. Roughly more or less $500,000 targeted toward future additional cost reductions. To Lynn's analysis on the numbers of 800,000, again, that's the number that I'm saying is really $1.6 million. And I think the Finance Advisory Committee, the new city manager and the city council should be tasked with closing that via an amendment that you could set a date certain on, if you wanted to say April or whatever. There's adequate time for a new city manager to get some comfort. If not, it could always be moved back, but get a date certain that you look for a target. And my suggestion there would be to target that as a goal, to do that with reductions, period. Not new revenue, because you're looking at $1.5 million to $2 million perpetual gap, and it is not all pensions. Pensions are going up in the assumption 8% a year. 8% of $6 million is $480,000, but you're running $1.5 million deficit each year. So there's another $1 million coming from your operations because the local economy is not going to support a 5 or 6% increase in costs. Now, I think if you can close this gap, get the new city manager, get that objective, and keep working at least solving that $1.6 million number, and then understand that you've got $1.5 million each year going forward, unless you do have substantial new growth, as was suggested. But I will tell you, every community in the state is having that same recommendation. So when we say we're going to grow industry, I would say there's 500 communities across the state of Illinois saying, absolutely, the answer is let's grow industry. And then there'll be another 500 communities saying we need some new roofs to help us pay for that. So they're all fighting the same battle, not dissimilar to NIU fighting their battle for new students. Well, every university's got that same message going in. So I see that as pretty common, and I think those two suggestions would be helpful. Plus, we have not even talked about this water fund thing that was a substantial part of the write-up, which could also be addressed in more detail if we meet regularly, and I'm suggesting every 2 to 3 weeks for the Finance Advisory Committee, as long as we can get staff support through that first quarter to drive an amendment with the new city manager.
And that pretty much aligns itself with what Ray's recommendation was.
More or less. More or less.
Yeah,
it's just the numbers are maybe a little different than.
Yeah. So what you're saying, basically, from your perspective, some of the additional revenue items, you're saying no to those. You're saying no to those. You're saying.
I'm saying put those off behind solving the solution in a cost reduction mode, because we haven't talked about the $2 to $3 million you need in capital. So if you're going to put new revenue into the system and you're going to go to the community and say I need new tax increases, and not address anything for capital needs, in a full-blown discussion of your 5-year projection, I think that could be short-sighted. Because then you're going to come back over the top and say, well, now I need additional money, not for operations, but for capital.
Yeah.
Streets and fleet.
Streets and fleets, yeah. Bill?
I think so. I want a question, then I want to make a couple of comments, if I may. Tom just mentioned that we have a balanced budget, but you're talking about an $880,000 gap. So which is it? Is there an $880,000 gap, or is the budget balanced? Which is it?
The gap is the variance to meet your fund balance policy. If you look at the money coming in and money going out strictly for FY19.
Okay, so that's my point. So I think in a lot of our minds, Dave and I probably agree on this, that if we want to continue that 25, we do have to make up that gap. And that makes the balanced budget, not just the spending in versus revenues. Now, let me go on and make a couple of other things. Kate, Lynn have both talked about, and so have some of the others talked about, a hiring freeze. In general, I'm agreeing to that. I think it needs to be 12-month, but not on all the positions that are listed. I do not want to freeze any of the public safety positions. I think that's doing a disservice to the members of our community in light of the last 18 months, what's happened out on the streets. I'm looking at it from off of table 5, with a 12-month freeze, not including the 4 police positions, the telecommunicator, the 2 firefighter paramedics, that we can still have a $500,100 savings right there. And that's, a good chunk of that, almost $900,000 that we're talking about. That's my feeling on it. Where do we find the rest of it? Do we look to, we just talked about Tony wants to put the $30,000 back in. So that goes the other way for downtown streets. We also talked about the 10,000 for a Convention and Visitors Bureau. So now we're
40,000.
we're back up to still about $440,000 we need to find out of this gap to meet our budget policy, our reserve policy. So where do we come with that? You know, but again, I think that 12-month hiring freeze, leave the public safety positions in there. That's at least how I feel about it.
Just one clarification.
Tom.
We keep working towards that 800. That 800 is really $1,600,000 in the gap, right? It's $1,600,000, not 800. That's why I'm suggesting you keep that budget open for amendments and close that, the remaining part, over and above the 6-month freeze.
And I'm not disagreeing with the remaining and open. I mean, I think that's something we have to do. And again, we talked about that last year, but we have to take a more active role in doing that in the coming year.
Well, I really agree with the timing that Tom's talking about. Give it time and the new manager in here too.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Before Ron, go ahead, and then I'll make it.
I'm sorry.
No, what I was going to say is does there seem to be consensus from Finance Advisory Committee at buying into what Tom's suggestion is?
My suggestion is really not a whole lot different than
Right. I understand.
the acting city manager and actually a
But,
couple
you know,
others with the 6-month freeze. Plus, we just keep working at it though until we.
I guess I'd be uncomfortable, Tom, if I leave tonight and I hear 4 members on the Finance Advisory Committee with views remarkably different from Tom Tarasinski.
I'm on board with
Could you clarify or rehash or summarize for us what the recommendations are again?
Well, from a Finance Advisory Committee recommendation, the intent here would be to recommend that a budget be passed, including a freeze that would include the freeze as staff has recommended in table 6.
Now, here's a question.
Table 6.
Excuse me, we've got this review of the proposed budget from Mr. Munch. Did you say you revised it and sent it out this afternoon?
He didn't send it to us.
So here's my question. Could we please get updated and current? Because I'm wondering what in here is valid and what's not. I believe most of it's valid. You're doing a very good job. But I can't tell you if we come into here and I found out the stuff I'm working and printed out and have studied doesn't quite match what was sent to City Council or to Chairman Peddle. And then does that make sense? That would help me.
Yeah, to be fair, we have not produced a full, fresh run of the budget. The information that was provided to City Council on Friday was basically a sentence or two that you've received tonight. So,
because the comments I wanted to make, if you can hold just a minute, I was going to say, you know, this amusement tax, I'm not really a big fan of that. It seems vague. I'm definitely not a fan of figuring out how we can squeeze Northern for more amusement money or whatever. You know, they're down a quarter of their population. They're back to late 70s, early 80 population. Why we would want to impose more burden and fee on them? I think they've got their own problems, and we count on those students. You know, figure what 7,000 or 8,000 students not spending the amount of money they did here 15 years ago is doing to the economy. I just think that's like killing the goose to be doing that. Do we need to be fair with them? Absolutely, as far as what we can expect, but I would be against that. I'm for, I know it's politically unpopular, I'd be for this home rule sales tax increase of 0.25%. I think we keep shuffling around, you know, it's like Chairman Peddle said, do we do what's politically popular or do we do what's fiscally responsible? And I think that's part of why we're in this problem. And I would agree, some of the stuff we're nickeling and diming on is why we're sitting here. I don't necessarily think all those meetings we spent on policy were a waste of time, because I don't think we understood the severity of the problem. And frankly, when we get the sheets, we don't have the formulas built into the cells that we can read. So I personally am upset that somehow we overlooked that. On the flip side, I'm not going to take responsibility for that, because I assume the numbers we get are accurate and on time. Now, that's, you know, you can say it's a programming error, but I think it was a necessary thing. We all felt it was. We had some disagreement at the time, but I don't think if we'd understood the finances were in the situation there, we probably would have spent all that time on that. I'm for a freeze, but I'd be for the selective freeze. I don't think we can just blanket all these positions. I think maybe at a minimum 6-month freeze, then you start targeting what areas are necessary. I'm not really clear where we stand on the airport. I don't know from the last 2 meetings if you're talking about zeroing that out, or we talk about getting new business. The airport is a business. I think that's short-sighted if we keep having a resentment that it's on a trajectory to make money. It's not where we want it to be. I think to look at that as a short-term fix is like somebody saying, I need a new car, and taking it out of their IRA for the future. They, you know what I mean? No person. That's my opinion on it. Wait a minute. Might be it. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Alderman Jacobson.
Jumping around yet again, and I apologize. In terms of the funding gap, the question Alderman Finucane asked is how can we have a balanced budget and an $800,000 gap? In looking at the budgetary numbers for next year we're balanced again. It's the budgetary gap's coming from fiscal 18.
Absolutely.
We overspent this year in this year's budget, and we didn't hit the targets, nor did we hit the revenues that we expected in terms of selling the resident officer house and some of the other properties that were thrown into the budget last year at the very last second to try to balance it on paper. It wasn't balanced then, it's not balanced now, and it carries forward into 19. So that $800,000 is actually this year's overspend that we now have to try to make up in next year. When looking at the 2019 fiscal year budget, we are balanced based on revenues and expenditures based on the last presentation we've seen. So I think the answer is both. Obviously, yes, they're two different. Where is that negative coming from? It's fiscal 18. In terms of the downtown snow removal, I appreciate that many of the merchants down there are not happy about a change in what was an otherwise free service they've gotten for at least a decade down there. And I think that was part of the discussion when we had the reduction talk, was do we reduce it outright, or do we act as a force multiplier for the businesses in terms of getting the main streets bid collectively and using our buying power to reduce that for them and asking for an SSA for them to pay for the services they're taking advantage of. And there was pushback at that point that it would be unlikely that 51% of the businesses or property owners would support that SSA. Again, I think this is the opportunity now that they see what the impact of that is. If they do want that service, and if it is vitally important to them, as they are claiming it is online in multiple blogs, then there's a cost for that service. And we don't mind stepping up and aggregating the cost to reduce that cost for you. But anywhere else in the city, whether it's a commercial building or a residential block, there's the same issues. There's property owners that are absentee, there's vacant property, there's those things. We expect as a city, especially on our snow routes, that those properties are maintained. And if they're not, they're fined for that to make sure that they are maintained. I don't understand why the downtown area would be any different than that. Again, the reality is they've received a free service for at least a dozen years, if not more. Now, the answer is, if it's important, then you need to step up and pay for it. If you don't want to do that and want to vote down the SSA, then it's your responsibility individually to shovel in front of your business, and your responsibility as the building owner to ensure that you have adequate snow contracting services to take care of that. And again, I don't think it should be the rest of the taxpayers in DeKalb paying for a very small area of businesses that don't feel they should have to pay for their own way. I don't think that's fair to the rest of the taxpayers. Again, in addressing some of the misnomers, when we're talking about squeezing Northern, an amusement tax wouldn't hit Northern, nor would it hit students directly. Students have all of their athletic fees included.
Explain what you were talking about then, about Northern paying for certain
They would
activities?
bill on our behalf. So if someone.
You said they could voluntarily do that, right?
Correct. If you or I wanted to buy a football ticket as a resident or even
I'm
without
a season pass holder.
Wonderful. So they would add voluntarily whatever our tax is locally, 5% to that ticket package. They would collect it from you, the ticket holder, and forward that to the city for the city services incurred of us, again, using the roads to go to football games, using the police services that are used to control all the parking lights and traffic control and those things, using the signage that we have to put up to direct that traffic. There's costs to those things.
There's
And
also,
we should
there's
pay for
also
those
income
costs.
from those things.
Correct, but the city should be recouping its costs directly from the users of that, which would be you and I or anyone that wanted to use that service, much as a sales tax would be or anything else, or a service tax would be. And again, it wouldn't hit the students and it wouldn't hit the university.
But don't you think people are, you talked about being taxed over taxed. Don't you think we're taxed enough without adding another fee on top of another fee to go see a football game?
Again, NIU already charges both the ticketing fee and
Correct,
other
but
fees.
what you're
to
suggesting is
recoup
adding
their
to that,
costs.
right? Are you suggesting removing it or adding it?
I'm suggesting that if NIU has administrative costs on those tickets, which they do, to cover their costs, that the city should look to recover our administrative costs from the people using those otherwise specialized services.
But that's the attitude of we resent that we're giving everything. We resent that we want businesses downtown, so by God, you're going to pay for the snow removal. That's what I'm telling you. People pick up from that. I've heard people in the gym say, that's ridiculous for the city to be charging store owners. I'm just telling you what I've heard from other people, that we shouldn't be charging. We want businesses downtown. This isn't exactly a real thriving downtown, by the way. Compare this to Sycamore, and I think
I would
this
say the
probably
same
might be a
for
good
many of our
thing.
neighborhoods.
Jacob, I don't know that's a good time now to be doing that. We want to talk about, do you want to grow or do you want to squeeze? Because that's the libertarian and
At the same time, do you think
frills.
Greek Row property owners that are struggling should not have to pay for snow services? Do you think people in the Annie Glidden neighborhood that's struggling, both economic and residential corridors, shouldn't have to pay for their own snow services?
I don't know. I'm not clear what you're asking.
Your question is that people are upset that why would we charge for a service that's being provided to a downtown business because it's hard to do business downtown. It's hard to do business on Greek Road too. You wouldn't expect to have.
I'm
free snow
suggesting
service.
citizens in the city view this as kind of silly, that we would hurt businesses. I live on South Second Street. It's an expectation that we have our sidewalk shoveled, and I do that.
Correct. So why shouldn't
if
the
I
business
go
owners have the same
downtown,
expectation?
Pardon?
Why shouldn't a business or a building owner downtown?
Well, have we
that
done
same
that in the
expectation?
past?
Jerry, could I say something here for a second?
Sure.
Okay, we're here for the big picture, okay?
Thank you.
And this is a conversation that should be held, but maybe not
I'm not
tonight.
sure this is our primary issue tonight. so
Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly.
Again, and talking
So-
about the one other big ticket item, sales tax, if we're going to do a sales tax raise, and it would, again, that's going to be a very difficult issue, and saying that it's a political issue, I made clear the last round when we talked about using it for operations in terms of adding more police officers to the streets a few months ago that failed. At some point here in the very near future, whether it's next budget year or the following year, we're going to need a significant stream of additional revenues to cover streets and fleet. That's the reality of the situation we face. The easiest and fairest way would be to spread that amongst the largest group of purchasers or of users, which would be sales tax. And again, if the discussion was down the road, do we have to increase that sales tax for infrastructure or to cover those needs? I think that's a more appropriate ask for it, to try to do it now as operations to cover a funding gap. Again, I don't think is the appropriate way to do it. I think we need to look and see how we're going to fund the big picture, the whole totality of the circumstances, and to understand that we're at limited revenue sources, and many areas are already taxed at a very high rate, where things like amusements aren't taxed at all. Again, some people are giving up a lot, and other businesses are giving nothing. It's time to even that playing field and make it fair to do business in the city.
Any other additional comments? And thank you, Alderman Fagan, for interjecting there. What I've wanted to do, as I have tried to do at other meetings that I've convened, and that is to try to get the greatest exchange of opinion as possible. And I think that we really need to do that now as we're meeting jointly with the Finance Advisory Committee. Now, having said that, Ray, where are we in terms of what it is that you feel you and staff need going forward as we move to the first reading of a proposed FY 2019 budget? Fair question?
Very fair question.
Okay.
Very difficult to answer.
Yeah, okay.
At this point, I think I'm fairly clear that there's some consensus in terms of additional expenditure reductions for FY19 in the terms of the hiring freeze in a limited format. Alderman Finucane was pretty clear in his desire to avoid at all costs any public safety freeze. It's been spoken about more generally by the rest of the group, so I suppose I would look for a consensus on that. Again, the recommendation of staff at this point, if we were to go through that full table, would be to look to table 6 as to what, you know, a realistic estimate is for a hiring freeze, and that includes some limited delay of public safety positions. Again, I'll make the point, you know, in terms of police, we're talking about delaying 2 hires until June 1st. We're functionally operating at a capacity lower than that since August. So if there's, you know, additional questions or input needed on that, you know, we could seek further direction from the chief.
Ray, if I could ask the chief a question. Chief, with the with new hires as it sits right now, you're probably looking at a several month delay anyway, aren't we, in bringing some new people on board?
Yes, currently we have 1 vacant position immediately and 3 that are going to come into effect the first week of January. So bringing them on, that whole process is fairly lengthy, and although it's gotten better, the history of getting those candidates hired, trained, and street ready has been in excess of a year.
Okay, now are any of those 4 positions already in the pipeline in terms of that we've already begun to try and hire somebody?
We're in the process, but in the early stages. We have just begun to do background investigations on the first set of candidates.
Okay, so best case scenario, and this would mean what's the earliest you could anticipate any of those officers being street ready?
The first potential vacancies, if we went as potentially recommended by the city manager, the first 2 vacancies could be probably filled by certified candidates. So that will take about 16 weeks off of once they're qualified to be hired, the training component of it, the basic training academy. So then they would go through an additional 16-week field training program. If there were no bumps in the road in that, it would be basically that second 16-week process.
But in essence, so while they're going through that 16-week process, they are on the payroll, correct?
Correct.
All right.
They're on payroll whether they come in as certified or they're going to the training academy.
All right, but so that's my question. Maybe I should restate it as the question is, what's the earliest you could expect people to be on payroll?
Depending on how the council approves the plan, if you approve to go as recommended, those candidates we would hire in January would be the first ones on the payroll.
Okay, so they could in essence be on payroll as early as say February 1, and then the other 2, as we move through that process, would be much further out.
Yes, but what interim city manager Munch had said is, for that second group of candidates, they're probably going to have to go to a training academy. At least we anticipate that at this time. So there's a drop-dead training academy date, which I believe comes in June. So they would have to be hired at least a few weeks ahead of that time to get everything prepared, uniforms, to get ready to go to the academy. So I would say 2 to 4 weeks before June, so no later than the beginning of May.
All right, so I guess what I'm hearing from you, though, is that the interim city manager's plan on 6 here, on table 6, is pretty close to what reality would be.
Yes, and there's always a potential that, you know, if the council saw fit, we could delay it into try and get a fall session going. So there is some flexibility built into that, but as it's been proposed is how it is.
Now, well, I don't want to delay it, so, you know, so that's my point I'm trying to make. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Chief. Any other comments? Okay, to get back, yeah, Steve.
A while ago, Mr. Munch mentioned that, talking about new hire city manager, he mentioned we hope to have one in 60 days. I would have much rather heard 6 days than 60. I know it's a process, but to me, it seems like whomever that city manager might be ought to be involved in what's going on.
Absolutely. And I think the 60-day window that Ray alluded to is probably absolutely the furthest out. You know, I would hope that we're in a position to announce a city manager by the city council meeting on the 18th of December. Now, if that's the case, best case scenario, depending on who that individual is and what kind of lead time there is from the time we finalize a contract with the city manager, the new city manager, and when that person comes aboard and in that office is taking an active role, what we're talking about here, that could very well be, could be as early as January. So, yeah, there is a sense of urgency. However, the sense of urgency cannot fall in the face of doing something that is hasty. And yeah, and that doesn't make sense for the residents of this city. Yeah, Alderman Jacobson.
I would make a motion that we consider approving table 6 as a included reduction in the fiscal 2019 budget.
Second.
Can we take action tonight on a motion like that at a special city council meeting?
Mayor?
Yeah, yes, Lynn, right.
Our discussions over this hybrid type of a meeting has all sorts of statutory implications, particularly for the Open Meetings Act. So I would suggest that if any vote were to happen tonight at all, that the separate bodies, the City Council and the FAC, should be taking separate votes and acting separately on any motions. Also, I would point out that no action has been listed for this meeting, so that's another hit against the Open Meetings Act.
That's why I asked the question.
Right, for the special meeting, if there's not an action on the agenda, you probably shouldn't do it.
Yeah, Dean, do you concur with that?
Yeah, I do. It's always been our recommendation, if there's going to be specific action taken, that we list action items on the agenda. Approval of recommendation regarding
That said, there's nothing that would prohibit these bodies from developing a strong consensus that would give us direction moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's what we're looking for, David,
In
is
the
consensus.
past, we've done straw polls, I believe. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I believe we have done those, just straw polls.
Well, I think what I would encourage, instead of having a motion and a second to that motion and a vote, is that Dave, and did you second it?
No, I didn't. I believe it was Alderman Favor.
Who did Alderman Favor? That you simply agree that, in your opinion, there is consensus that we should do this. And if other members of council agree with that, plus the recommendations of the Finance Advisory Committee, that we move forward with that.
I would withdraw my motion.
Huh?
I would withdraw my motion and ask, does anybody have an issue then with taking the recommendations in Table 6, whether they be on the FAC or the council?
Gary, if I may.
Yes.
I would go ahead and concur with Alderman Jacobson that as a recommendation to staff that we go ahead and include that as part of the next step in the budgeting process.
Yeah, there seems to be a sense of consensus there. Do I hear that?
I concur, whatever it's worth.
Again, I just want to make sure that we do not get our own procedures in a tizzy here because of a vote. Because as I preceded or said at the beginning of the meeting, we are not taking any firm action here that would require a vote. I beg your pardon?
That wouldn't have been a final action anyway, but
Right.
it would have been a recommendation to add to a final action agenda later.
What we need to do is to come to some kind of a consensus, and hopefully, Ray, you have a little bit more consensus now than you did at 5:30 when we started this meeting. What I think we really need to do is, based on whatever we come up with on first reading on Monday night for the FY 2019 budget, that we're confident that we've done something that captures the spirit of what we talked about tonight, and that in that spirit there seems to be general agreement between the Finance Advisory Committee and the City Council. Does that make sense?
I would think so on this particular instance because of the reduction in expenditures. I think that's pretty well agreement amongst the two bodies.
Do we need to talk any more and get some consensus in terms of what revenue increasing items might be something that we're going to have in that mix of conversation on Monday night?
We're still at a $340,000 gap with that recommendation.
Yeah. Yes. Right.
So
At least.
that would probably be the more important item to receive some consensus on, because the way we would anticipate presenting a budget ordinance is any revenue adjustments to any current code or new code would be included in the budget ordinance itself. So to have consensus on any revenue options would be important at this point.
I think it's important that we have both of those, if in fact there's consensus, that we look at the revenue enhancements plus the reductions. We've already talked about the reductions as it relates to the hiring freeze. But we can shake our heads until 10:30 tonight. But we need to make sure that as we're shaking those heads, that we give council some clearer direction for Monday night's action, and aligning with that is direction to you, Ray, as you prepare the ordinances for consideration on Monday night.
Correct.
Because we're going to have the first reading of an ordinance on what we're talking about right here tonight on Monday, December 10th. Alderman Fagan.
I think correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Terzinski said about us with the cuts and with the additional revenues to follow later with the adjustment of budget. I think that's where we were going, where you were trying to push this cart down the road, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. My suggestion was, again, to task the Finance Advisory Committee, and you could make a suggestion to that effect if you so desired, to continue to meet to close that gap, which is really, again, 1.2 million on a go-forward basis. And at that point, that could be closed, then to look at the revenue streams at that time as a budget amendment at a date in March or April, but a date firm so that we continue to meet and push this thing forward for you and bring these things back around, which includes a capital discussion at that point, not an operating.
Alderman Verbeek.
And I think great work throughout the year to everyone on all of this. It's been a very, I guess, knowledge-building year, at least for this council member. I think we have tools in our toolbox. Council invested in what was called the EPI report. And in that report, if anyone has revisited that, the information was clear, the direction was clear. A number of people have changed around this table since that report came out. And certainly I would defer to perhaps Alderman Jacobson or any others that were around at that time. But if we look at that report, what's wrong with, we invested largely in it, what's wrong with revisiting that, helping Finance Advisory Committee and helping City Council with how do we really approach these challenges? To the comments of increasing taxes to climb our way out of this is not possible. But we can see clearly that the cost of doing business will continue to increase each year. So what is that responsible way of addressing these cost increases? How do we match that with revenue that our property taxpayers can afford? And how do we not reinvent the wheel, but yet use advice, which from everything I've read has been excellent advice with regard to the EPI report. I think, and for a new city manager, laying that groundwork and some consensus around and among council as to what we expect will be very important.
Any other comments? Alderman Fanouken.
Well, just in light of our action last week, I'd say that the property tax levy is probably set as it is. I mean, we had that discussion at the last council meeting, voted, despite an amendment, voted to keep it at just the increased new construction rather than the overall increase in EAV. And barring some last-minute revelation, I think that that's probably one of the revenue enhancements that may be off the table at this point. I would at least be willing to discuss the other three, but I don't have any firm recommendation on what that might be at this point. But again, in light of Mr. Terzinski's recommendation, maybe we leave that as part of that open budget item, that we look to fill that remaining close to $400,000 gap early next year.
Can I chime in on that real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Please. So I think that's a very fair way to approach it. The only thing that I would add is, as you enter the fiscal year, you again will extend any delay in collection should you choose to pursue any of those revenue options. So as long as you have an understanding of that as it pertains to fiscal year 19, it's important to keep in mind.
Totally understand that.
Okay.
Mike?
And I would agree with that, waiting. And again, what these policy decisions, how are they affecting our goals? We, early on in my term, we sat down and we talked about what are the goals of City Council, what are the goals for the City of DeKalb. We need to start aligning these budgetary decisions to the goals we've set in place with what we would like to accomplish. I think it's been a great exercise this year, but I think it's very difficult for me as a policymaker to get into some of the granular discussions of this position or that position when I'm more interested in looking at, you know, more of the broader priorities of delivering services to a level that's within our means.
Okay, in summation, if I can do that, or allow me to do that, is that the consensus is that we take the crux of what is in Table 6 in terms of the hiring freeze, and given the conversation that we've had tonight regarding the advisability of continuing to engage the Finance Advisory Committee in discussions in terms of how we can continue to reduce the deficit that was caused during the FY 2018 year, and that we do that at a time, sometime after the first of the year, at which time we will be charging our new city manager as one of his or her primary responsibilities going forward. Does that make sense? Ray, do you have enough to formulate a ordinance which we can look at on Monday night for consideration in a first reading form?
Yes. The only two components that have been brought up tonight that I'll ask for very brief clarification on, and those are the two items that we had previously identified. Now there's some reconsideration, would be the DC CVB funding reduction at $10,000 and the CBD snow removal. So is there a desire by the council to keep those in the budget for the time being?
When you say keep them in, do you mean keep the reductions in or to return them to their original dollar amount?
Return them to their original level. Thank you for clarifying.
Alderman Noriko.
I would, at this point, advocate for returning them to their original level with a stronger feeling for the CVB addition than the central business. I think that there might be possibilities to consider other options for that, but I'm kind of open on that one. But I think
$40,000. Is that a $40,000?
30. I think.
30, I believe.
Yeah,
30,000.
but you know, for all the reasons I've enumerated and others have as well, I think it's pretty important, the 10,000.
Okay.
Mike?
So if we restore the DCCVB $10,000, where should that come from? Any suggestions?
Well, obviously we need to have a discussion about that, but I would be willing to take another 5,000 from the municipal band and also take a look at the athletic sponsorship, athletic event sponsorship, maybe another.
We're simply adding $10,000 to a budget gap number, which is, you know, at this point, something with 6 figures, not with
7 figures.
Or with 7 figures, perhaps, with, you know.
So less of a need of an exercise.
Where that comes from, Mike, at least to my way of thinking, is almost irrelevant at this point. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, Now, what other items on the proposed FY 2019 budget do we need to talk about tonight? Tom, other members of the Finance Advisory Committee, Ron, Bob, Steve, Lynn, are you comfortable in determining that we have enough, that we've chewed on enough tonight, that you're comfortable with not talking about any other items? Or because we still have the airport, we still have streets and fleet, we still have water, do we need to do anything tonight that we cannot accomplish during the discussions that we have with our new city manager after the first of the year? Is that a clear question? Yeah, Tom.
Yes, I think it's a clear question. I think as long as we leave those as well open, the discussion on the airport is not one of being negative. It's just a reality that that money's already spent, so it's gone. And clarifying these schedules and getting you the correct schedule so that we're all talking about the same number, I think would be the objective of our very first Finance Advisory Committee that we could have in the 3rd or 4th week of January, that would wrap up, give the staff enough time to actually produce a budget, roll in the suggestions that have been made and adopted and approved, and then we'll deal with rolling that forward. So as long as we keep the water on, because I know there's a loan in there and there's some other stuff that's pretty significant that we really haven't looked at at all.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But I also understand that there's probably a capital budget expenditure commitment that staff would like to get on the table for real roads to get really fixed, so that can't take long. But at least as long as those are open, I think we'd be fine. I would be fine at least.
Good.
I would support Mr. Tarasinski's outline, particularly with the timing with that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm fine with it.
Okay, anything else for the good of the cause? I can't tell you how much. Yeah, Alderman Verby.
Just whatever we can do together as a group to offer that clear direction to a new city manager. Try to dedicate these revenues. You know, we've talked about scenarios for streets. I guess try to come up with those plans or those guidelines for our new city manager so that there is less of this exercise for that person, and that we've already laid that groundwork for that person. This is our clear direction. What can you do to help?
Lynn.
Just one more comment about the emergency personnel, the police, the fire, the folks who take good care of us. Yes, we need those folks and we want to see their ranks full, but I feel compelled to say we can't run an advertisement to hire those people that at the end of the ad it says must provide own patrol car or bicycle. We've got to have equipment for those men and women to use to protect us. It's a whole system. So the issue about the fleet, it really troubles me, because we have to have reliable equipment and vehicles for those people to use. I know that's just something else, sorry.
No, I think
but
it troubles roads to drive that equipment on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it troubles all of us. I think it troubles all of us, but it's folks around this table who are going to try to put a dent in it. Let me just make one final comment. I think this is very important. We've decided that we have enough consensus that I'm going to see Mr. Munch tomorrow morning, and I'm going to say, Ray, as soon as you have that ordinance crafted and drafted, I want to see it. Because if I were a city manager applicant, I want to know what's in that ordinance. I want to know what this council is asking. I think, frankly, I think what we've done tonight will be very, very positive for any applicant. So as we question the applicants on Thursday, yeah, we're gonna start the process at 8, and we'll be here probably till 5, because we have 6 candidates. That number still is live, okay, for Thursday. I'm going to want to hear some questions from the applicants. We're going to be armed with questions, but I want to hear their questions also. And some of their questions will certainly tie in to what we're going to be considering on Monday night. That makes sense?
Can I make one final comment?
Absolutely. You're the city manager.
For now. So, you know, in speaking of a new city manager coming on board, I think it's important to realize that this has been an extremely challenging year for staff. But the fact remains, there's a group of people sitting in the back of the room that are very committed to seeing that new city manager succeed, and we're here to provide them with the support that they'll need to work through this. And I think it's important to recognize those people. The team is smaller, but I like to think that, you know, the best people are left standing at the end, and, you know, we're ready to help that next person succeed. So onward and upward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Anything else for the good of the cause? Steve?
Just one thing, get back to what I said a while ago with the TIF transfer and what's the right number. If we make that very conservative number, 150 instead of 100, then we have snow covered and Visitors Bureau covered.
Okay. I'd entertain a motion to adjourn this joint meeting of the...
Mayor?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to recommend, again, to comply with the Open Meetings Act, that we have separate adjournments for the council and for Finance Advisory Committee.
Yeah, I have to commend Lynn. We've had a number of meetings since she's been a city clerk, and she's trying to keep me in line as much as possible, and I do appreciate that. So much like we did in terms of opening the meeting, I would entertain a motion from the Finance Advisory Committee and a second to adjourn this meeting.
I'll move.
It's been moved by Ron Parts, seconded by Steve Parker. Just now, the Finance Advisory Committee, all in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Oppose? So move on the part of the Finance Advisory Committee. Now, I'm looking for a motion from City Council.
So moved.
Second. It's been moved by Alderman Jacobson, seconded by Alderman Fanouken. Any further comments? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So move. We are adjourned.